If you Google Alan Dershowitz and the word controversy, you get nearly as many hits as if you just Google his name alone. A Brooklyn native who has been called, quote, the nation's most peripatetic civil liberties lawyer, the best-known criminal lawyer in the world, and America's most public Jewish defender, he joined the Harvard Law School faculty after clerking for Judge David Bazelon and Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg, and has remained there as the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law for 50 years, until this semester, after which he is retiring to put, as he puts it, changing his career. While he's known for defending a variety of clients, including Anatoly Sharansky, Klaus Van Bülow, OJ Simpson's appeal, Michael Milliken, Mike Tyson, he continues to represent numerous indigent defendants and takes half of his cases pro bono. Professor Dershowitz is the author of more than 20 works of both fiction and nonfiction, including The Case for Peace, Chutzpah, and Reversal of Fortune, which of course was made into an Academy Award-winning film. He's here this afternoon to talk about his memoir, Taking the Stand, My Life in the Law. Among my favorite words from the book is this one from, quotes about the book is this one from Larry David, who said, "I loved this book. If I could trade lives with anyone, Dershowitz would be high on my list, minus the death threats and the tchotchkes." Appearing in conversation with Mr. Dershowitz is Richard North Patterson, best-selling novelist of more than 20 books, including Degree of Guilt, Silent Witness, and most recently, Fall from Grace, and its prequel, Loss of Innocence. Needless to say, we are in for a treat. Please give a warm welcome to Alan Dershowitz and Richard North Patterson to the JCC SF.
Well, it's wonderful that all of you are here. My job is to bring Alan out of his shell the best I can. Fortunately, we know each other a little bit, so I'm hoping you'll have a couple of things to say. So I want to start by asking a little bit about some of the more personal aspects of this extraordinarily fine book you've written. And one of the really delightful parts for me was reading about your very misspent and unpromising youth in Brooklyn. Despite which your life seems to have worked out reasonably well. But for your generation of American Jews, a modest and pretty coastally insular upbringing in Brooklyn seems to serve as a springboard for incredible accomplishment in the wide world. I can think of Barbara Boxer, Mickey Drexler in business, Larry David, to name a few. So how do you explain that phenomenon?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for lending me this wonderful, wonderful man, Richard North Patterson, whose novels I just love and read all the time, and I learn so much from. He's one of the few novelists who not only entertains and gives you a kind of literary experience, but also teaches you about gun control, teaches you about the abortion debate, teaches you about presidencies, teaches you about so many things. So I'm so happy to be on the same stage with you. We were not brought up in the same way or in the same place. You're a Midwesterner, I'm from Brooklyn. And Brooklyn is a very interesting place. The Brooklyn of the 1950s, 40s, post-war period, time of Israel's war for independence. I was so lucky to grow up in Brooklyn. Of course, when I left Brooklyn, I thought it was a one-way street. Whoever thought about going back to Brooklyn? Today, my daughter, who's 23, all of her friends live back in Brooklyn. It's become the hottest place to live, the best place for restaurants. It wasn't the water, it wasn't the bagels, it wasn't the Bialys. I think it was the fact that we were the generation that had no barriers. Oh, sure, there were some barriers. Technically, we couldn't get into Harvard, Yale College. There were quota systems. We couldn't work in the Metropolitan Life. We couldn't work for the telephone company. We couldn't live in Tuxedo Park. But when Jackie Robinson came to bat in 1947 for the Brooklyn Dodgers, I was 9 years old. Everybody in my neighborhood said, if Jackie Robinson can play second base for the Brooklyn Dodgers, we can do anything. And we had no limits on our aspirations. We grew up in an expanding economy. You know, our parents were Depression children. My mother had to drop out of college in the first semester, first person in the history of her family to get into City College at the age of 15 and a half. She had to drop out in 1929. There's a great bumper sticker at the Harvard Business School that says, never confuse brains with a bull market. We grew up in a bull market, and we had all the opportunities, and we knew we would be better off than our parents, and the tragedy is our children are not necessarily better off than we are. And so, you know, I was a bum in elementary school and high school. In my book, I have an actual photograph of my report card from my senior year in high school, and it was a 60 in physics with a failure, a 60 in math failure, 65 in Hebrew, 65 in history, and an 80 in English.
I could have done that well in Hebrew.
Probably would have. And my principal called me in one day and said, you know, Dershowitz, you got a good mouth on you, but a brain, not so much. So you should figure out a career. This is an Orthodox rabbi, remember. You should figure out a career where you use your mouth a lot, not your brain. He said, I have two suggestions. Two suggestions. One, you could be a conservative rabbi. He couldn't even pronounce the word reform. Or else you could be a lawyer. I wasn't smart enough to be a rabbi. So I became a lawyer. And I never got a B. I went from being a straight C and D student in high school to a straight A student in college and law school, and it was just a period of 3 months between May of 1955 and September of 1955 that I made that transition. And I still can't understand why. In my book, I explore it. I try to figure out what happened in those 3 months. Was it leaving a parochial education system and going to Brooklyn College? I'm not positive. Was it having somebody, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, told me I was smart? He was the first person to tell me I was smart. Everybody else told me I was stupid. You know, I was wise, but I was a wise guy, but not a wise person. And I think I wanted to show them also. And so all of these things contributed to changing me, but it was a pretty dramatic change in a very short period of time.
You know, along that line, your relationship to Judaism has evolved away from Orthodox practice toward a more Reformed practice, and certainly a rich but a more culturally Jewish identity in which you're deeply immersed. Now, how has that history and your ongoing identity as a Jew impact the choices that you've made in the remarkable career you've had as a teacher and a lawyer and as a public intellectual?
It's a great question. I am a Jewish lawyer. Now, what does that mean, to be a Jewish lawyer? Sandy Koufax was a Jewish baseball player. He grew up on my block. But what did it mean to be a Jewish baseball player? His curveball wasn't Jewish. His fastball, you know, didn't come out of his Jewishness. The only thing that made him a Jewish lawyer is not something he did, but something he didn't do. That is, he did not pitch on Yom Kippur, which made him a Jewish baseball player. My Jewishness has a much greater impact on my career. I teach from a Jewish perspective. That is, I don't limit my background to Blackstone and Marshall. I teach my students about Maimonides, my secular students in law school, because Maimonides had a lot to say about self-defense, about the right of a society to protect itself. I teach my students from a Talmudic perspective, from a biblical perspective. I teach a course called The Scriptural Sources of Justice. I wrote a book called The Genesis of Justice about the Bible's impact on our legal system. I don't pick my clients based on their ethnicity. In fact, some people think I should. When I was part of the OJ Simpson defense team, I got a lot of hate mail from Jewish people saying, why are you on OJ's side instead of the Goldman side? Because Goldman, who was killed, was Jewish. That's not the way I pick my clients, but I pick my causes in part from my ethnic background. I certainly, I think I would support Israel the way I do, even if I were born Christian, because I think that I can make the liberal strong case for Israel, critical of some of its policies, obviously, particularly its settlement policies, but I'm a strong supporter of Israel. So I think my Jewishness is inseparable from my career. My students know I'm a Jew when I teach. When I first came to Harvard, I was called Harvard's first Jewish Jew because there were several Jewish members of the faculty, but I wore my Jewishness on my sleeve, and Professor Paul Bator called me in when I was about to come up for tenure and said, Alan, you're hurting your case for tenure by being so overtly Jewish. And I said, look, you have to take me the way I am. That's who I am. And take it or leave it. I have other schools that are interested in me, and I'm not going to change who I am. And I refused to teach on Shabbos, on the Sabbath, when I started teaching at Harvard Law School. I was still Orthodox at the time. And now my Jewishness is much more in the form of support for Israel. I still go to the synagogue because I love the cantor and I love the rabbi, and for me it's nostalgic and traditional. I am not a theological Jew. That is, I don't buy the notion that the Torah was handed down from a mountaintop. It's a beautiful metaphor, but if God wrote the Bible, he was an underachiever. If human beings wrote the Bible, they were incredible overachievers. It's a brilliant book for humans, and a pretty good book, but not a great book, written by an omniscient, omnipotent God. The part about, gay men being executed, I think a good editor might have dealt with that in a more effective way.
Very difficult question for you, which is paid by the suggestion that you are sometimes viewed remarkably as a contentious human being.
Me?
Yeah, you.
Contentious?
Now, your many friends, me included, know you to be kind, generous, a great promoter of other people, and almost alarmingly disinclined to say bad things about anyone. On the other hand, some of the people who don't know you at all, except as a public person, see you as contentious, perhaps even immodest, and inclined to fuse with other public personalities. Mm-hmm. So how do you explain the not-so-occasional disparity between how those who know you see you and how those who don't know you perceive the public, Alan?
It's such an interesting question. The New York Times book review came out today, the book review of my book, and it's generally a very positive review. But it starts out by saying that in my book, I present two characters. The Dersh character, the guy you see on television, confrontational, always pointing his finger, and always nobody can be right, and the Alan character, who people know and who I hope you've described accurately. And then it goes to describe how I represent those two different personalities in the book. Larry David did something wonderful the other day. Larry David, the comic writer, there was an event commemorating my 50 years at Harvard. It had all what you would expect, stuffy people saying nice things about me, including several justices of the Supreme Court, President of the United States, former President of the United States, and then it had Larry David. Larry gets up there and he's sitting down with his sneakers and his feet on the desk, and he says, the world's divided into two groups when it comes to Alan Dershowitz. There are those who don't know him and hate him, but there are those who know him well and they just love him, etc. He said, I want to tell you, I fit into a third category. I know Alan really, really well, and I hate his guts. I can't stand him. And then he went on to say he's too smart, he's too this. He went on to compliment me in a backhanded way. But you're absolutely right that there is this real dichotomy. And my son, I quote him in the book, says he can tell immediately when somebody comes over to him whether they know me or they only know me from television on how they describe me. I really am a pushover in my personal life. My wife, Carolyn, is here with me today, has never lost an argument with me in all the years we've been married.
Lucky woman.
Yeah. And so I spend so much time being confrontational in my professional life that in my personal life, I really need warm, supportive friendships. I don't like to say anything critical about people I know. Excuse me. I have a cold. I was in the Red Sox locker room the night they won the World Series, and Big Papi poured a bottle of champagne on my head. I hope that's the reason for my cold, because that would be a good reason. But I do have a little cold, so I apologize. Go ahead.
Your career has been amazing, and starting with your mentors, David Bazelon and Arthur Goldberg, you've known many of the greatest legal minds in the entirety of American history. So who among them stands out for you as the best combination of intellect, practicality, and humanity, and who influenced you the most? And if you answer Robert Kardashian, by the way, we're starting over.
I worked with Robert Kardashian, as you probably know, in the OJ Simpson defense case, and I actually met his daughters when they were little.
They peaked then.
There are so many people who influenced my life and my career in different ways. I think Judge David Bazelon influenced my career in showing me that you can be both a mensch, a Jewish mensch, and also an active liberal and civil libertarian, Arthur Goldberg in the same way. But I think the man that had the most influence in my career choice is probably somebody who many of you don't know. General Telford Taylor, is that a name that's familiar to you? Chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, former head of the FCC, professor at Columbia and Yale Law School, great writer. The reason he influenced me so much is he was my professor at Yale, and I took every course that he offered. And he was the first person I met who could be a full-time law professor of great distinction, a full-time litigator in the United States Supreme Court. He argued some of the most important cases involving civil liberties, a full-time public intellectual, a full-time writer. He wrote many bestsellers, Grand Inquest, Vietnam and Nuremberg. And I have a terminal case of what's called FOMS, F-O-M-S, fear of missing something. And I never wanted to choose whether I wanted to be a professor, a lawyer, a writer, a speaker. And Telford Taylor showed me the way to be all of those things at the same time. And we had long talks about that. And he said, Alan, you just have to keep your priorities straight. Remember, you're always a teacher first. And you teach your classroom, you teach in your audiences, you teach when you're writing books, you teach when you're on television, and you even can teach in the courtroom. And so I've modeled my career on Telford Taylor. When I was a second-year student at Yale Law School, the Eichmann trial was taking place in Israel. Telford had been hired by the ABC network to be their reporter and to go there and cover the trial. This was the most, since the Nuremberg trials, the most famous trial of a Nazi. And he asked me to go with him, to be his translator and to be his assistant. I had to tell him that I got a 65 in Hebrew, so I don't think I'd be a particularly good translator. My Hebrew was mostly biblical. I could command people. Lech lecha la'artzecha, come thee to me country, but I could not order a sandwich. So I didn't go with him to Israel, but then I had the thrill of asking him to come with me to the Soviet Union. When I was asked to defend the Jews of the Soviet Union, Sharansky and others, I formed a legal team, and I put him at the head of the legal team. And he and I traveled several times to the Soviet Union, to Israel, to other parts of the world on behalf of Soviet Jewry. And it was one of the great thrills of my life to be able to work with my mentor, my role model, and we achieved some success in helping release Sharansky and others from Soviet prison. And that, somebody once asked me what the biggest legal fee I ever got, and I said it was from Sharansky, and they said, we didn't know he had any money, and I said he didn't have any money, I represented him for free. But when he left, when he got out, and he walked over the Gleineke Bridge, and we met for the first time, and he threw his arms around me, and he whispered, Baruch matir asurim, blessed are those who free the imprisoned. Tears flowed out of my eyes. It was the biggest fee I ever got. I'll never get another fee like that.
That's a wonderful story.
Oh, can I tell you just one more story
Absolutely.
About Sharansky? This sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. Okay. Gorbachev, Václav Havel, Sharansky, and Dershowitz get into an elevator. Actually happened. It was Jerusalem. It was the Inbal Hotel, formerly La Roma Hotel. It was the celebration of Israel's 60th birthday, and all of us were invited by President Shimon Peres to give papers. And we all got into the elevator together. Gorbachev looks at me, I had met him before, and he says, so you're the big shot lawyer who claims you got these two guys out of prison, right? And both of them said, he is. He was our lawyer. He got us out of prison. Gorbachev said, I got you out of prison. And Havel said, if you got us out of prison, why didn't you get us out any sooner? He said, that powerful I wasn't. And, but that's a true story.
It's a great story. I mean, you know, to deal with the cutting edge of the law, the most difficult areas is to deal in controversies. It's observably true that, for example, pornography and feminism don't generally seem to mix very well. In your defense of free speech, you've often tangled with feminists over whether pornography is demeaning to women, arguing that there is no empirical evidence that it endangers women. Do you distinguish pornography involving women from that involving children? And what position would you take concerning a graphic cartoon showing sexual exploitation of young children?
Boy, it's a great and difficult question. You know, my first case in the Supreme Court involved the film I Am Curious Yellow. Anybody remember that film? It was an anti-war Swedish film, which today you could see not on cable, but on regular television, and it would probably get a GP rating or maybe an R rating at worst. And they were putting somebody in jail, the owner of the Cinema Symphony Theater in Massachusetts, for showing the film I Am Curious Yellow. I argued that case in the United States Supreme Court, and after that, I argued the Deep Throat case involving Harry Reams, and I became the go-to guy for pornographers. In fact, the two people who argued the case in the Supreme Court for I Am Curious Yellow were me and Nat Lewin, also a Yeshiva University high school graduate. You had these two Orthodox Jews arguing for Swedish pornographers in the United States Supreme Court. And, you know, for me, pornography or obscenity was always the tip of the censorship. And I was always worried that if you can censor I Am Curious Yellow today and Deep Throat, the limits begin to dissipate. And so I have defended pornography, and I've won all of our cases. And in fact, I'm not sure I've contributed much to the great culture of America, but if you look on any cable television, go to any movie theater, you can see that there's no limitations on adult pornography. I think child pornography is very different. Child pornography does not involve consent. Children can't consent to be exploited. Adults can consent. I'm not a fan of pornography. To this day, I still have not seen the movie Deep Throat, and I've made a policy of not seeing it, because when I argue cases like that, I don't argue for the pornography, I argue for choice. I say, I have chosen not to see Deep Throat. Some people have chosen to see it. That's what I'm arguing for, the right of Americans to choose what to see and what not to see, and not to have anything thrust on them involuntarily, as long as the theater doesn't have offensive advertising on the outside. If people choose to go in, they should go in.
So what about my hypothetical of a cartoon graphically portraying
It's a terrific question.
Sexual predators in kids? You don't have real victims there.
That's right.
You don't have a kid being exploited. You have an idea, a boundary being shattered, essentially. So where do you come out on something like that?
Have you ever considered being a law professor? I mean,
no one ever considered it for me, I will tell you that.
That's the kind of hypothetical that obviously I would put to my students. And there have been cartoon-generated child pornography. Some of them look very, very, very realistic. And for me, I would err on the side of free speech. I would err on the side of permitting it and keeping the marketplace of ideas open. I haven't seen the evidence that strongly suggests that people viewing pornography are incited to commit crimes of violence. If there were to be overwhelming evidence of that, I think one might come to a different conclusion. Remember that the greatest violence in the world has been perpetrated on the basis of probably two books. One of them the Bible, and the other probably the Communist Manifesto, both of which are protected by, and maybe Mein Kampf, all of which are protected by the Constitution. About 10 years ago, I was in a bookstore with my son, and I found a letter written by Thomas Jefferson on July 4th, 1801, from the White House. And I bought the letter, and I wrote a book about it called Finding, Framing, and Hanging Jefferson, because I framed the letter. And in the letter, he talks exactly about this. He says, what should we do to people who preach evil and may even contribute to evil being caused, crimes being caused? And Jefferson said, in our country, we err on the side of punishing the evil, but not punishing the advocacy of evil. So on balance, I would go after pornographers who made a film that exploited actual children against their, obviously children can't consent, but I would defend the right of computer-generated child pornography and hope that people would shut down the marketplace of ideas. I have to tell you, I had a case a couple of years ago where some prominent athlete called me, and what happened is a child of an athlete was photographed naked on a beach outside the country somewhere, and his picture was put all over the internet by some blogger focusing attention on the child's penis. And the question was, could we get that taken off the internet? And I said, why don't we do something a little bit different? And what we did is we started a campaign on talk radio, particularly sports talk radio, against the person who did this thing. And they shut down his website because nobody went to it. They basically boycotted it. And that was a more effective way than bringing the police in to try to stop it. And so I think the marketplace of ideas is a viable metaphor for trying to let speech be engaged in and let the public make decisions about it.
You know, in that area and others, you're sometimes in a position of being a contrarian. For example, your book can be read as suggesting that as a moral proposition, Julian Assange is a more admirable figure than paragons like Seymour Hersh or Bob Woodward. Is that a fair characterization, a fair reading, and where do you draw the line on disclosure of government secrets?
Okay, so I have a major chapter in my book comparing the pornography debate with the national security debate and saying that they're not in any way really comparable, that the pornography debate just isn't all that important. If we ended up in a society where we banned pornography as long as you drew the line at pornography, you know, we might be a less diverse society, but the issues aren't as compelling. And the issues on the other side aren't particularly compelling. Who cares if somebody reads pornography? Who cares if somebody, you know, gets his jollies that way? So both sides of the issue are not important. In national security, the stakes are so much higher. You get issues like Snowden publishing material through Greenwall. You get issues like Manning publishing material through WikiLeaks. The stakes are incredibly high. On the one hand, it could really have a major negative impact on the national security of the United States. I'm not suggesting either of these two have, but it could if you produced and published nuclear codes or the names of spies or the locations of safe houses or our plans for Iran. That could have a devastating impact on national security. On the other hand, to prevent that through censorship could have a devastating impact on the nature of democratic debate. So the stakes are incredibly high, and we have to draw lines. Pornography, you don't have to draw lines. Just let it be. You prosecute the people who make the films if they involve children, but you don't have to worry about the pornography stuff. In the national security area, it's very, very difficult. I, too, would err on the side, again, of letting the material be published, except in extraordinary cases where the national security is really placed in grave and immediate danger. Justice Holmes got it right when he talked about clear and present immediate danger of risk to the national security. Who should make those decisions? Very, very hard. President, Congress, they all have a stake in this. Most of censorship that's going on today, most classification is not done to protect the national security. It's done to protect the rear ends of the political figures. And they're overclassifying enormously. So you understand the motivation for people like Snowden and Bradley to get some of this stuff out. And getting some of this stuff out has generated a major debate, particularly about the NSA. So, you know, although Snowden may in the end have achieved good result, he did it illegally. There's no question stealing secrets from your employer, the United States government, for whom you have pledged to preserve secrets, is a crime. So I distinguish between Snowden and Bradley Manning on the one hand, who are criminals, and WikiLeaks and Greenwald, who you might disapprove of, but who are publishers. And in the United States, again, we draw the line at the act of stealing, which is criminals, by the way, so was in the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg was a criminal. He wasn't successfully prosecuted, but he stole secrets. Whereas the New York Times and the Washington Post performed admirable functions under the First Amendment. So those are the lines I would generally draw.
One of the issues that I think a lot of us who follow law have struggled with is the whole issue of defamation and the fact that a public figure, as opposed to a private person, can only sue for defamation if the false statement is made with actual malice, either the knowledge that it was not so or reckless indifference to the truth. In your view, does it make any difference how the public figure became public? For example, the 3 young women kidnapped in Cleveland who became public figures only because they were the victims of a terrible crime.
Absolutely, of course it should. I was a law clerk for Justice Goldberg when New York Times versus Sullivan came down. In fact, I tell the story that one day, Justice Goldberg's birthday, he got a plate, a big basket of fruit, and I brought it into the justice, and I said, "Happy birthday." And he said, "Who's it from?" I said, "Oh, I didn't check." He said, "Well, check." And it was from Katharine Graham, who was then the publisher of the Washington Post. He said, "Send that back immediately. We have New York Times versus Sullivan before us. Washington Post is a party to that. I don't want any fruit from Katharine Graham." I said, "Mr. Justice, I ate a banana." He says, "Alan, you go right down to the fruit store, you buy a banana, you put it back in the, and then you send it back." That was Justice Goldberg. So I was the law clerk when that case came down, and Justice Goldberg was a public figure who had been much attacked. He had been Secretary of Labor, and he was very ambivalent, but he wrote an opinion in which he said that obviously First Amendment has to trump over individual people. I've been defamed repeatedly. There's a cartoon on the internet. If you just Google Dershowitz cartoon or something, or you'll see a cartoon done by a neo-Nazi Holocaust denier, but encouraged by Norman Finkelstein, which has a picture of me, a cartoon of me sitting in front of a television set during the Lebanon War, and I am sitting in front of the television set masturbating in joy over the bodies of dead Lebanese children. I mean, and that's, talk about defamation, but that's protected speech. It's protected both under the Supreme Court decision saying that cartoons and other forms of humor, political humor, are protected also because I'm a public figure. Now, I chose to become a public figure. I didn't have it thrust on me, so I have to have a thick skin. If somebody is made a public figure against his or her will by being the victim of a crime, I would apply a completely different standard. I also don't believe that anybody has the right to deliberately lie, even about a public figure. You have the right to be wrong. You have a right to make an honest mistake. You have a right to err on the side of getting a story out rather than suppressing it. But if you know for certainty that a story is false and you publish it, that should be defamation. But let me tell you how complicated this is, and I write about this in my book. 25 years ago, if you outed a politician and said he was gay, that was defamatory. Can you imagine any court today saying that it is defamatory to call somebody gay? That would be a major insult to all gay people. Saying that somehow it's worse to be gay than to be heterosexual. 50 years ago, a newspaper was held liable for having a typo, calling somebody a colored person rather than a cultured person, and simply one-letter typo. Today, it would be unthinkable. So our definition of what defames you changes. Now, I get defamed all the time over Israel, particularly. I am called a fascist, a Zio-fascist, a supporter of torture. In the back of my book, I think I'm the only book ever written that has negative blurbs. I purposely put the blurbs of my enemies in the back of the book. Noam Chomsky. Dershowitz is not very bright, and he's strongly opposed to civil liberties. Norman Finkelstein. Dershowitz is evil like Adolf Eichmann, offering Nazi moral judgments. Glenn Greenwald. Dershowitz is deranged. Professor Francis Boyle. He's a war criminal. And another one says,
well, that
I'm
last
an enemy.
is a little harsh.
A little harsh. I have answers, too. I mean, I don't let them get the last word. After the Jimmy Carter thing, I don't read Dershowitz. I have positive quotes from President Clinton and President Obama, and positive quotes. But, people hate me because of my support for Israel and defame me and lie about me repeatedly. What's his name? Andrew Sullivan, who's regarded as a prominent public figure, has publicly accused me of being a supporter of the Greater Israel. Greater Israel means that I'm a supporter of the settlements and against the two-state solution. Just a categorical lie. I've been in favor of the two-state solution and opposed to Israel's settlement policy since before Andrew Sullivan was born. But people don't hold him accountable for his views, and I try to expose it in the marketplace of ideas. And in my book, I go after all these guys. I am not in any way reserved about that. One more comment I wanted to make. You mentioned that I'm known for my, quote, humility and self-effacing quality. I have a picture in the book, a wonderful picture of me with President Obama and his national security staff, and they're all laughing at something I just said. What they were laughing at is, the President asked me how my book was coming, and I said, well, I'm having a little trouble, balancing the pride I have in the work I've done with what you have to write with some degree of humility. And he said, Alan Dershowitz, humility? And so I'm actually proud of the fact that I'm not humble. And, I've accomplished a lot in my life, and I want people to know it. I've come up from a fairly low position. I've managed to win a lot of cases and do some good. And I think false humility is the worst kind of lie. And I tell the story in my book, in the opening pages, about the rabbi on Yom Kippur who prostrates himself on the ground and says, when you do the Olenu prayer, and who says, God, I am nothing before you. And the cantor standing next to the rabbi says, I am even less than nothing. I am less than nothing before you. And then the lowly shamus sees the rabbi and the cantor saying that, and the lowly shamus gets down and says, God, I too am nothing. And the rabbi turns to the cantor and says, look who thinks he's nothing. I hate false humility. I know you get better reviews for your books when you try to be humble and try to deny that you were the person who accomplished things. I just don't play that game. And you have to take me as I am, and I'm proud of my accomplishments, and I write about them in a proud way.
Well, as your friend, you should be. You should be proud, and I've tried to live my life in the same principles, so I can hardly complain. You're talking...
Look who's trying to be humble.
Yeah.
No, this guy has every right to be as proud of his writings as anybody. So.
Well, thank you. So with that kindness, let me ask you a truly dreadful hypothetical, which was opened up by the fact that you have been defamed numerous times. And it has to do with the same problem we were talking about, the public figure problem in the area of defamation. Suppose that the Harvard Crimson published an accusation by a female student that you'd coerced her for sexual favors. Further, suppose that the Harvard Crimson knew that she'd been institutionalized for mental illness and had made several uncorroborated allegations against others. Finally, suppose that they did not choose to report this fact in the article about you, and without investigation, publish her accusations on the ground that in themselves they were inherently newsworthy because you were a public figure. Should you be entitled to demand redress for the harm to your reputation, or would the First Amendment protect the Harvard Crimson?
That's a great question. It's a great hypothetical. I would have the right to sue the Harvard Crimson under those circumstances, and I would choose not to sue them. But I would conduct a major campaign against the Harvard Crimson or any newspaper that did this, and I would have no hesitation about closing them down in the marketplace of ideas, about urging people not to read the newspaper, urging people to be very critical of the way they read it. But I've had this experience, and a guy made up a story about me some years ago. Not like that, but just made up a story. And I called the Boston Globe, it was in the Boston Globe, and the Boston Globe did its own investigation and determined that the story was absolutely false. What happened is I was going after a political figure in Boston named William Bulger, whose brother was Whitey Bulger.
Oh, him.
Yeah. And I was saying basically that, Billy, you can't really understand Whitey Bulger without understanding Billy Bulger. Billy Bulger was the godfather. Billy Bulger's good friend went after me in the Globe and said that he and I had been walking together down the street one day, and we saw an Asian woman in the street, and I said to him, and here's the exact quote, "Don't you, three dots, don't you just love Asian women? They're three dots. They're so submissive." So in one sentence, he has me being a racist, a sexist, and being disloyal to my wife. The only problem was I never met him. never walked down the street with him, never had that conversation, never would have that conversation. I hate submissive women. My wife is the least submissive person imaginable. So the story was totally false. I was able to prove that this guy had written a similar story about somebody else 25 years ago, using almost the same words, and he made it up, and the Globe had to pay a substantial judgment. And so I did go after him, and the Globe made a contribution to my favorite charity to set me right. But in the end, I didn't sue the Globe, although I had the right to. So I think there's a difference between having the right to do something and choosing to do it. Also, the Crimson is a student-run newspaper. I would have much more hesitation. I would try to use this as an educational moment to teach the students at Harvard how to read newspapers, how to write newspapers, and how to deal critically with defamation, but I wouldn't sue.
On to a forum that you spent a good deal of time dealing with and thinking about the Supreme Court. One of the strands that's run through recent Supreme Court jurisprudence is, quote, originalism, unquote. Justice Scalia's assertion that we should interpret the Constitution in light of what the framers would have intended. What is your opinion of this theory, and how does it influence the law in such difficult areas as the death penalty?
Well, obviously, in the death penalty, if you go back to originalism, there's no debate. My first job for Justice Goldberg was to write a memorandum of law finding reasons for striking down the death penalty as unconstitutional. The first thing I said to him is, Mr. Justice, the death penalty is mentioned several times in the Constitution itself. How can you say it's unconstitutional? He said it's a living Constitution. It changes with the times. And obviously, that's the opposite approach from Scaliaism. Now, I am a big believer in checks and balances, not only between legislature, executive, and judiciary, but I believe in philosophical checks and balances. I wouldn't want to live in a world where a Kantian philosophy ruled or where a Benthamite philosophy ruled. I wouldn't want to live in a world where only one philosophy dominated. I think it's great to have different philosophies check other philosophies. The same thing is true with a Supreme Court jurisprudence. I'm glad we have one Scalia on the Supreme Court. I'm glad we don't have more than one Scalia on the Supreme Court. I'm glad we have, Justices Breyer and Kagan and Sotomayor on the Supreme Court as well. They check and balance each other. My only real major criticism of the Supreme Court, and I wrote about it in my book called Supreme Injustice, and I write about it in this book because I predict the Supreme Court's going to lose its influence over the next 50 years, much of its influence, is that for the first time in modern history, the Supreme Court has shifted from being ideological to being partisan. There are now justices on the Supreme Court who will vote in order to help the party that they support. Bush versus Gore cannot be understood in any other way. If the case were Gore versus Bush, it would have come out exactly the other way. And I pointed my finger at Justice Scalia when he came to Harvard one day, and I said, you violated your oath of office. You decided that case based on partisan considerations. And this was in front of a group of faculty, and he said, I don't like being accused of violating my oath of office. I said, then don't do it. And we have this friendmity. We're friends and enemies. We're enemies politically, we're friends personally. And so I think, and I wish Justice Scalia would stick to his originalism all the time. Selective originalism is very dangerous. But I think there's a plausible argument that the framers intended the Constitution to be interpreted the way they wrote it, and there's also a plausible argument that because the framers wrote phrases like due process, equal protection, cruel and unusual punishment, those are phrases that don't have content, that have to change with time, that they intended it to be a living Constitution. Even Hamilton, who was probably closer to Scalia than other framers of the Constitution, Hamilton said that for a Constitution to endure, it has to be written in phrases and terms that are enduring by their nature. That suggests to me that there is room for reinterpretation. Take the Second Amendment. Nobody knows what the Second Amendment means. Nobody knows whether it was intended to convey to each individual the right to carry weapons to protect themselves, or whether it was really focused on state militias not being regulated by the federal government. And yet we have an interpretation of the Second Amendment which does not seem originalist. Justice Scalia joined it. Justice Thomas wrote it. And I doubt that many of the framers, living in an age of nuclear weapons and high-velocity machine guns, would today say that that interpretation of the Second Amendment was what they intended. So it's a hard question, and I think that it's important that we have different ideological points of view represented on the Supreme Court, but justices should not act as Republicans or Democrats. Once they wear the robe, they are only Americans.
Well, you know, a related question, in his confirmation hearing, one of your more prominent former students, Chief Justice Roberts, characterized his view of judging as, quote, judicial modesty, unquote, and likened a judge to an umpire calling balls and strikes. In your view, has his performance as Chief Justice conformed to that claim?
Absolutely not. And I like John Roberts. He's a lovely, lovely man, a very decent man, a very honorable man, and probably the single most qualified person to be nominated to the Supreme Court in many, many years from his background and experience. He was a superb Supreme Court litigator and eminently qualified. And, but when he talked about the role of a judge, obviously he is too smart to believe that judges are not influenced by their ideology. Now, I quote in my book a quote from Jeffrey Toobin, another of my former students, who says, he has it on high authority, that John Roberts told people that when Citizens United came to the court, that his object was to see which way that case would most benefit the Republican Party. Jeffrey Toobin says that. Jeffrey Toobin's usually a reliable reporter. I'm actually in conversation with him Monday night at the 92nd Street Y. I'm going to press him on that quote, because that is a devastating quote, if it's true. I know it's true about Bush versus Gore. The reason I'm a little ambivalent about Citizens United is I myself am ambivalent about the result in Citizens United. As a First Amendment person, I'm generally on the side of the freest free speech, as was the ACLU. The American Civil Liberties Union favored the corporations in Citizens United over your organization, Common Cause, and other groups like that. So it's a close case, and either way it was decided would be reasonable and fair. But if any justice put his thumb on the scale because he wanted to see it help the Republicans, that really undercuts the entire credibility of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's disturbing when we see controversies now reported, and among the things that is reported in reportage about court cases is the president who appointed the justice or the judge involved. That didn't used to happen. Now it's considered to be highly relevant, precisely because the courts are so politicized. But
you remember in the Nixon Watergate case, it was 9-0, including several justices who appointed Nixon to the Supreme Court voted against him, and that doesn't happen these days anymore.
No, and it's obviously disturbing to a lot of us. On another subject, one of your cases has always fascinated me, and one of your really more high-profile and controversial clients was Mike Tyson, who was charged with raping a beauty contest contestant. What was your perception of Tyson as a person? And what role did the rape shield laws, which have passed to facilitate rape prosecutions, play in whether Tyson, in your view, was fairly treated by the legal system?
Well, Tyson was not fairly treated by the legal system. The legal system in Indiana was more corrupt than any legal system I've ever confronted, including in the Soviet Union, in China, and in many other countries. It was, and if you read my chapter on the Tyson case, you will come away convinced that that was not even a semblance of a trial. I first met Mike in his hotel room the night before he was going to go to jail, having been convicted and was waiting a sentence. And he said to me, before I hire you to be my appellate lawyer, I want to know two things. One, do you think I'm innocent? And second, what do you think of me as a man? And I said, I have no idea whether you're innocent. I haven't read the transcript. You've just called me. I have an open mind, and I will read the transcript. All right, that's legal talk. What do you think of me as a man? I said, Mike, you're a schmuck. He looked at me and he said, turned to his guy, to King, what's his name, Don King. Hey, Mr. Man, call me a schmuck. He said, why am I a schmuck? I said, you went to a hotel room with a woman you didn't know at 3 o'clock in the morning, knowing what your reputation was, knowing that you were wealthy and vulnerable. If you're innocent, you put yourself in a situation where you could be falsely accused, and that's my definition of a schmuck. Turned to his people there and he said, this man called me a schmuck. He's right. I was a schmuck. Why didn't you call me a schmuck? I want to hire this guy. I want people to call me a schmuck when I'm a schmuck. That's Mike Tyson. And
beats a right cross.
And the case was outrageous. The case was outrageous. And if you just read the record in the case, this is a woman who had previously accused her high school quarterback of raping her when they had consensual sex together. And when her father threatened to beat her up because she had lost her virginity. Her father threatened to beat her up. And she then accused this man of raping her. And the father said, all right, we'll take you to the police station. And then she backed away from the story and said she had consensual sex, whereupon the father beat her up. And then she had consensual sex with Mike Tyson, and her parents were coming to town. She was afraid, and she made up the same kind of story. And then she made up a story on the stand, as did her parents, that she was not interested in the money, that she hadn't hired a lawyer, that she didn't know what a contingency fee was. And it turned out that she had hired a lawyer on a contingency fee. They had talked about money. They had talked about selling book rights. They had talked about all that, and this judge, who was herself a rape prosecutor for years, picked by the prosecution to be the judge in the case, kept out all of that information under the Rape Shield law. And then when it came to appeal, there were 5 judges on the Supreme Court. 2 of them voted for us, 2 of them voted against us, and it was affirmed on a 2-2 vote because the 5th vote, Judge Shepard, sent his wife over to speak to me at a Yale reunion in order to make an excuse for him to recuse himself from the case. And as soon as she introduced herself to me, I said, I can't talk to you, when I walked away. And he recused himself, allowing Tyson to go to jail on a 2-2 vote. And I tell the story in the case. It is absolutely outrageous, and it ruined this man's life, it ruined his career. And my wife will confirm that Tyson used to call me from jail all the time, and he'd have to wait an hour online to get on the phone. And one day he called me, and my daughter was crying in the background. She was a kid then. And Mike said, oh, I hear your daughter crying. Let me hang up. I'll call you back later. He was so considerate. When he was in jail, he didn't have any money. He bought turkeys for everybody with just borrowing money, everybody in his neighborhood, because he had promised them turkeys. He ran out of money, and when he fought his first fight, he paid back every single penny he owed. I like Mike Tyson. I did not like Leona Helmsley. I did not like some of my other clients, but I've always liked Mike Tyson, and I always felt he got a bum rap.
You'll note I've stayed away from OJ entirely. You've had enough OJ in your life.
Can I give you my 30 seconds on OJ?
Sure.
Just to make sure you all know, we didn't win the case. They lost the case. Just 2 little vignettes. Number 1, you all remember the glove. They tried the glove on. Did you know that under California law, Darden could have had OJ try on the glove outside the presence of the jury to see if it fit before asking him to try it on in front of the jury? But he was so arrogant he didn't do that. He had him try it on in front of the jury. It looked like it didn't fit, and that avoided OJ's need to testify. It was such a dumb decision by a prosecutor. The other thing they did is, you may recall, they found blood on O.J. Simpson's sock, and the blood was the blood not only of O.J. Simpson, but of his victims. What a perfect piece of evidence. The problem was, the blood they found on the sock had EDTA, a chemical not found in the human body, found only in test tubes. It's put in test tubes to preserve the blood and make sure it doesn't coagulate. So the stupid cop, Van Adder, had poured blood from the test tube onto the sock, not knowing we would catch him, because we were experts in the forensics and the science. Then the sock itself had blood equal, mirror image blood on all 4 sides of the sock. So the same thing was on this side, the inside, and the 2 other sides. Obviously, you don't have to know Dexter to know that if you are wearing a sock and blood is splattered, you'll find mirror images on the first side and the second side, but when it gets to the 3rd and the 4th side, they would be crystallized transfers, not mirror images. And only get mirror images if your sock is being laid flat on the ground and you pour the blood on it. So the jurors really didn't conclude that O.J. Simpson was innocent. They concluded that the state was guilty. They came to the conclusion, essentially, that the police tried to frame a guilty man. Frame a man that the policemen believed were guilty. So I just have a test question for you in the audience. If you were jurors and you came to the conclusion that the defendant was probably guilty, but also that the state almost certainly deliberately planted evidence against him to prove his guilt, how many of you would vote guilty? Hands up. How many of you would vote not guilty? So we'd probably have a hung jury with this audience. So there was a lot of misunderstandings about that case. I'm very proud of my role in that case because I helped expose police misconduct on the part of the LA police, LA prosecutors. Better 10 guilty go free than 1 innocent be wrongly confined. I write about that in my book. But I was so hated during the OJ case. You know, people come over to me always at events like this and say, "Oh, Dershowitz, I think we may be related." You know, during the OJ case, nobody claimed to be related, even my mother.
I have a brief story about this that I really need to share, which I think I told you about. One of the other guests at Nancy's My Wedding, besides you, was a fellow named Ron Kaufman.
Right.
He was a Republican operative. He was Bush 1's political director. And at that time, he and Alan had a certain resemblance. If you didn't know them well, they both had mustaches at the time. Ron told the story, which I found more amusing, I think, than Alan did, about sitting in the airport in Chicago, and a couple of law students come to him and say, "Professor Dershowitz?" And Ron says, "Yes." "Professor Dershowitz, we so admire your defense of civil liberties. You're one of the people who's inspired us to be a lawyer." Ron says, "Thank you." And then they say, "In fact, we were so impressed with your courage in defending OJ Simpson." And Ron says, "That's nice of you." Then he says, motion closer, he says, "Problem is, the son of a bitch was guilty as hell."
I just have to top that story because, you know, when I grew up, there was a show called Can You Top This? Comedians. So this is a name-dropping story. Bibi Netanyahu, who I've known since 1973 when he was a student at MIT, gets elected prime minister the first time, and he invites my wife, my daughter, and I to come to see him in Israel. We go over to his office, and we schmooze, we take a few pictures. Then he says, "Alan, I need you to come into the inner office, which is the most secure office in the world. Nobody can bug this office. There's something I need to ask you." I thought he would ask me about Iran, about something. He says, "So, Alan, did OJ do it?" And I said, "Mr. Prime Minister, does Israel have nuclear weapons?" He said, "You know I can't tell you that." I said,
We've got about 5 more questions, and there are all sorts of questions I'd love to ask you. 5 more minutes, but just a couple more. You write about Roe versus Wade, which created or recognized the constitutional right to an abortion. In your view, what were the positive and negative results of that decision?
Well, I certainly support a woman's right to choose abortion. I think it's a very complicated and difficult question, though. It's not like gay marriage. There are no issues on the other side of gay marriage or gay rights. Who cares how people practice sex in the privacy of their homes or in their marital life? But abortion, if you believe that the fetus is a human being, has a soul, if you religiously believe that, or has potential viability, you're really choosing one person's life over another. It's a very, very hard question. I come out on the side of a woman being able to make difficult choices about her own procreative rights, but I don't think it's an easy question. The decision in Roe versus Wade was very badly written. It was written not from the point of view of the woman's right, but really more from the point of view of the doctor's right. Talked about privacy, and if it really is, a fetus is really a live human being. This is not a privacy issue. This is a choice of evils issue. And so I think Roe versus Wade would have been better if a woman's right to choose abortion could have been established legislatively, if the public got behind it and understood this is a complicated issue, but on balance, women's rights should prevail over the right of the fetus. It didn't happen that way, and what happened is it put to sleep the right to choice movement because they were relying on 9 men in robes, all men at the time, and it gave birth, literally, to the right to life movement and empowered them. Rick has written a brilliant book on this subject, a novel on this subject, in which he, with great nuance, goes through all the complicated elements of the right to choice, right to life debate. And I think the Supreme Court, it would have been better, and Justice Ginsburg thinks the same thing now, if the Supreme Court had deferred and stayed out of it for a few more years, let the states make decisions legislatively, and then if they had to decide it based on more enduring principles than the viability of the child and the 3-trimester distinction, and maybe do it on the ground of prejudice and discrimination against women, that it denies women the equal protection of the law, not to permit them to make choices about their procreative freedom. But it's a very complicated and difficult issue, and I try to sort out the complications and difficulties in my book.
One more question, and we're going to invite questions from the audience. It's about Israel. You've consistently spoken out against one-sided and dishonest denunciations of Israel in the United Nations and elsewhere. You've also criticized Israel's settlement policies, yet you are widely seen as an unyielding defender of Israel and the policies of Netanyahu in particular. In your view, is there a peaceful, reasonable, achievable solution to the problem of Israel and the West Bank Palestinians? If so, what form should that take, and what will it require of Israel?
Okay, you got about 4 or 5 hours, folks? Look, I have always been a critic of Israel's civilian settlement policy. Since 1973, I wrote about it when Elan Moreh was first established. I'm in favor of Israel's military occupation of the West Bank until peace is achieved, but not the civilian settlement policies. I am not a supporter of all of Netanyahu's policies. I was a big supporter of Rabin's policies. Were I an Israeli, I think I'd probably tend to vote more on the left than on the right. On the other hand, I am a very strong defender of Israel's right to defend itself against aggression, Israel's right to make sure that Iran does not have nuclear bombs. And in that respect, I'm very close to President Obama's positions on Israel, critical of the settlement policy, favorable to Israel's security needs, hopeful that a two-state solution could be achieved. Where I differ with President Obama, and I'm not sure if I pressed him he would really differ on this, I do not believe Israel should go back to the 1967 lines. 1967 lines would include Israel giving back the Kotel, the Western Wall, the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, the access road up to Hebrew University, and other areas that are necessary for Israel's security. I don't think President Obama wants to see Israel go back to the 67 lines, but he says that should be the starting point of the negotiation. That's a mistake, in my view. If you start with the Palestinians having all these important positions and then have them have the right to negotiate and barter what they get in exchange for that, President Abbas told me personally that he would ask for a great deal in exchange for the Kotel, for the Western Wall. It's all geography, location, location, location when it comes to real estate. So he would want 10,000 acres in exchange for the 2 acres that are the Kotel. So I think you start with reasonable adjustments that Israel had the right to make as the winner of a defensive war against Jordan in 1967. The end result, however, shouldn't be that different. My view is that Israel should be the Israel that now is within the security barrier. It should include the various settlements that are right outside Jerusalem, Malaya, Dumim, Gilo, and then there should be land swaps for the Etzion block, the Ariel block, but that Israel should basically take about 5 or 6% of what was Jordanian territory in exchange for 5 or 6% of what has always been Israeli territory. I think the solution is very obvious. As I've said to both Abbas and Fayyad when I've met with them, if the 3 of us could sit in this room without worrying about our constituencies, we could come up with a solution in 15 minutes. We know what the geography will look like. We know that there can't be a right of return of 4 million Palestinian refugees. We know that Palestinians have to control their own destiny in East Jerusalem. We know what the parameters look like. The problem is that both sides have constituencies. And one of the reasons that it's become harder for Israel to make peace now is because they brought 1 million Russians in, which was one of the greatest things that Israel ever did. The dream of Zionism is to become a place where Jews all over the world who are persecuted and discriminated against can live. So that's a very positive thing, 1 million Russians. Startup Nation has been a function of Israel's bringing in high technology. It's the first immigration in history to raise the educational level of a country. The bad part of that is most of the Russians vote right and make it a little bit harder to have peace. There's no free lunch. It's never possible to, the 2 reasons why it's been harder for Israel to make peace is, 1, the Russians have come, and 2nd, Arafat turned down Camp David and Taba. which would have been a wonderful deal for the Palestinians, and it destroyed the peace process, the peace parties in Israel, and encouraged the election of people more from the right. So it's complicated, and you can't demonize. As President Clinton said to me once when we were discussing the Middle East, he said, the problem with Israel is, damn it, it's a democracy. You can't tell them what to do. The people have to decide. You can tell Jordan what to do, just call the king. You can tell Egypt what to do, just threaten to cut off aid. You can tell other countries what to do. You can't do that with Israel. Israel is a democracy. And so I had suggested to President Obama that he go to Israel and that he speak directly to the people. And I helped him in formulating some of the things he said when he went to Israel, and I was very happy, and so were the Israelis very happy with his speech when he went there. So I do think that it's a work in progress, and I think that a reasonable peace is in the interest both of Israel and the Palestinians, and I strongly support it.
I would add in our national interest, I think,
Right. I agree.
as well. Briefly, because you're as much of an insider to this process as any American Jew not directly involved could be, what is your perception of these early peace talks we're having now and where they're going?
I think they're moving slowly, gradually in the right direction. I think they're working from the bottom up. They're not trying to create big, large solutions immediately. And I think that because it's now, yes, it's in the American interest, of course, but I think because it's in the Palestinian interest and in the Israeli interest, I think that the Arab Spring, which has turned into a cold winter, has made it clear that the interests both of the Palestinians, the secular Palestinians particularly, not the Hamas thugs, but the secular Palestinians, to make peace with Israel and for the Israelis to make peace with secular Palestinians has become fairly obvious to intelligent people on both sides.
Well, this has been an entire pleasure, this aspect of it. Now we have, before you sign books, we have audience questions. My understanding is that people are going to materialize on both sides of the aisles to ask questions.
Wow, it's nice to see you all.
That appears to be happening. So I guess we'll start out over there and go back and forth.
Yeah, we're going to have time for just a few questions. And I just want to remind everybody that if you haven't filled out one of these slips, we're going to be drawing for free tickets at the end of the Q&A. So now's the time, just a reminder to fill it out and get it to one of our ushers. Thanks. Okay, you want to start on that side?
Okay, first question over on your right.
Excuse me, I want to go back to the child porn issue. I understand that you your defense perfectly well, but what about the children that are the victims? Normal porn, there are no child victims. There are adults who participate, but in child porn, there are definite victims.
That's my point.
How can that be defended?
That's my point. I said I would not defend anybody who made a child porn movie with real victims. The question that was put to me was computer-generated pornography, and I think there you strike the balance in favor of free speech.
Next question on this side.
Under what circumstances would you sue for libel? You've made several distinctions where you hypothetically thought you had the right to sue but would choose not to. And what do you think about televising Supreme Court proceedings?
Oh, I think Supreme Court decisions should be televised. In fact, I think most court decisions, most court proceedings should be televised with few exceptions. You know, I've not found the case yet where I would sue, but I can imagine a situation where somebody deliberately, willfully said something that they know was false about me, and it was an adult in a commercial enterprise. I would sue, and I wouldn't feel uncomfortable about doing it. You have the right to be wrong, but you don't have the right to willfully and deliberately try to destroy someone's reputation. Yeah.
Okay, question over here on the...
I'd be more likely to sue if somebody defamed my children or my wife than myself, because, you know, I can defend myself. I have access to the public media where I can get on the media and defend myself, but more vulnerable people can't do that. Yeah.
Thank you. Am I on? Yes. So, like many in the audience, I'm very grateful, and you're a personal hero ever since my brother became a public defender, to speak to your last point. And with respect to the very vulnerable, I'd like to wonder if you could share some comments as we go into a new phase in the trials that are taking place in Guantanamo. I'd be very interested in your opinions on that.
Guantanamo ought to be closed. It ought to be closed immediately. It has become a horrible, horrible symbol of something, and the president said he would close it. I don't understand why he hasn't closed it. I mean, the politics are very difficult. Both Democrat and Republican senators and congressmen are saying, not in my backyard. Sure, close Guantanamo, but don't put any of the prisoners in our backyard. I think all Americans have to share. The hardest question about Guantanamo is, what do you do with people who can't be convicted of crime because either the evidence against them comes from secret sources of undercover agents, etc., or we just don't have the evidence, but they're saying right from their cells, let us out so we can kill more Americans. And you are 100% certain that if you let them out, they'll become terrorists. Should we introduce a system that Britain has, that most European countries have, that Israel has, called administrative detention or preventive detention? We already have it for sexually violent criminals. Should we have it for political criminals? That's a great debate, but it should not occur in the context of Guantanamo. That ought to be closed. Yeah.
Okay, question over here on your right.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you, Alan. Sure. You say you're an opponent of the settlements, and I'm not saying that I'm a defender of them.
Civilian settlements, right.
Okay,
yeah.
Civilian settlements. I'm not saying that I'm a proponent of them or defender of them, but there are 1 million Arabs living inside of Israel as citizens. Why shouldn't there be a Palestinian state with, say, 80,000 settlers being citizens of that Palestinian state?
I'm completely in favor of that. I believe that no country has the right to be Judenrein. No country has the right to say, we will not accept any Jews. They have a right to say, we will not accept Jews who want to live as Israeli citizens in the country of Palestine if it were to be established. So my view, and Abbas has been ambivalent about that, and I think he's taking the wrong position on this. My position is any Jew who wants to live in Hebron ought to be entitled to live in Hebron as a citizen, as a resident of Palestine. He could be a citizen of Israel, but as a resident of Palestine under Palestinian authority. So I would distinguish between settlements that are part of Israel and individuals who want to live as citizens of another country. Jews should be allowed to live anywhere in the world.
Next question on this side.
Several years ago, Jimmy Carter wrote a book on the Palestinian-Israeli situation and got a lot of criticism because of it. I wonder where you come down on.
Well, I wrote a book against his book. I wrote a book called "The Case Against Israel's Enemies," Jimmy Carter's and others. I think Jimmy Carter has become a barrier to peace, and I think he has been bought and paid for by Saudi sources. It's going to be interesting because he's been very quiet on Israel lately since Saudi Arabia has become closer to Israel over the Iranian issue. And if you just look at the financial support that the Saudis and some Wahhabis and some Holocaust deniers, including the Zayed Foundation, has given the Carter Foundation and Jimmy Carter, you really begin to wonder a little bit. Jimmy Carter never met a terrorist he didn't like. He embraced Yasser Arafat. I mean, literally embraced Yasser Arafat, a man who killed Americans, a man who killed the highest-ranking black American diplomat in the Sudan, a man who inspired and facilitated the Olympic killing of 11 Israeli athletes, and had never had a good word to say about any Israeli leader. I think that Jimmy Carter has a real problem when it comes to the nation-state of the Jewish people. And I wrote about that, and I pull no punches. I used to be a friend of Jimmy Carter's. I supported him in his first election campaign, and I no longer can be regarded as his friend. And I have a blurb in the back of the book where he says he doesn't read me. I read him. I read him very carefully and very critically, and I respond on the merits. I've challenged him to a debate. He turned it down. Brandeis University offered us both a chance to debate each other. He spoke, and then I was asked to speak. He left the stage before I spoke, and I did a criticism of his speech. I do not accuse him of anti-Semitism. His closest advisor was Stuart Eisenstadt, who was not only Jewish, but a very active, involved, deeply committed Jew. I don't think Stuart was thrilled about his book, Peace Not Apartheid. And I think Jimmy Carter has really hurt his standing in the world and has become somebody who can't be taken in any credible way when it comes to the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. Last question?
We have one more question, but before we get to it, I just want to ask Ron Winchell to identify himself. Okay, Ron, you won 2 tickets. See me during the book signing, okay? I'll be at the book
Okay.
signing table.
Okay, last question over here. on
Last
the right.
question.
Thank you, Alan. I know I'm not asking you to comment on Obamacare, but I know that you've been working for better access to people for mental health, and I'd just like to ask you, where you think we're going on that, and are we actually going to get it?
Okay, look, I don't know the technicalities of the various proposals for health care, and I'm not an expert on how the website is working. I have to tell you, I was thrilled when finally, after too many decades, we finally are approaching something like universal health care for Americans. It has been a disaster that we, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, have been providing inadequate medical care for people who have prior conditions, people who can't afford it, people who are uninsurable. So I give both Hillary Clinton for her efforts when she was the First Lady and Barack Obama as president A+++ in their effort to bring about changes in health care. And I think we ought to, with that spirit and that in mind, and in the notion of tikkun olam, which is so important in the Jewish tradition of repairing the world and healing the world, do everything in our power to make Obamacare work. That doesn't mean not being critical of specifics and not saying that this could be better and that could be better. I'm not an economist. I don't take any position on that. But just let's look at the big picture. Let's look at the big picture and say that there are so many people today who have access to health care and will have access to health care who didn't have access to health care in the past. And as far as mental health care, we have to remember mental health is health. It's just like every other kind of health. There is no difference morally and conceptually between someone who has cancer and someone who has schizophrenia. And we have to stop in any way demonizing or in any way denigrating or looking negatively at people who have mental illnesses. And it's a serious problem in America, and I would hope that our healthcare system would address mental health as forcefully as it addresses physical health. We have the right to good health care. We have the ability to provide good health care, and we ought to all stand behind efforts by the government to make health care available to every American. Thank you.
Good job.
That was great. Thank you.
Again, I'd like to thank Alan for the pleasure of this conversation. One of the many pleasurable conversations we've had, but particularly great because all of you were here. So thank you for coming, and I want to remind you that Alan is available to be met and to sign his terrific book. So with that, have a great afternoon.
And you should buy Rick's book too.